All right. I am joined by Gene Bajalan and Daniel Bessner, who viewers are likely to already know. Also by new guest, Kuba. Kuba, you want to introduce yourself?
My name is Kuba Wrzesniewski, and unlike your other guests, I am a failed academic, PhD from Berkeley, but working until recently in the military-industrial complex, and now for the Dubai Future Foundation. I've been ever since my graduate school research, I was working on Department of Defense projects as well as different private defense contractors in and around Washington. I have an appointment at the Reichauer Center, which is a think tank attached to the School of Advanced International Studies. So I've been in the DC policy, defense industry adjacent world for a number of years now. And that's where I've gotten my insights and my perspectives on what American policy, what American security policy looks like right now and what it should look like in the future.
No, fair enough. I mean, I'm look, as as one academic, who's been on the certainly on the receiving end of the neoliberal hellscape of contingentified academia. To another, I certainly don't hold that against anybody, and I like the fact that you're coming out of the belly of the beast, the military-industrial complex, because that definitely helps us for the perspective that we're trying to get right now, right? So, basically, what I wanted to talk to you guys about is what I was talking to Gene Bajalan and Daniel Bessner about a little bit last week. As a small part of a much bigger discussion then, and I think it's really something that deserves its own kind of specialized discussion, which is this much bigger question about, okay, it's easy and correct to say that U.S. imperialism is really bad. It is really bad. But if your analysis begins and ends there, then you really haven't said anything about the question of what we would like instead. Right? In other words, if not going to happen now with Bernie unless there's some miraculous anti-aging treatments that are discovered, before 2024. But if some future president, AOC or Rashida Tlaib or whoever ever did take office, and there was like a fill out the fantasy scenario however you want here. There's a Congress full of DSA members happy to go along with their agenda. Then the left spends a lot of time thinking about what the domestic part of that would look like. That we, in terms of certainly all the kind of immediate reforms that we want, Medicare for all, a Green New Deal, all of that stuff. We spent a lot of time thinking about that and pushing what that would look like. And, even in terms of more radical horizons beyond that, right? I mean, there are lots of socialist, economists, thinkers, who spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, could we have economic planning? What would that look like? But we spend hardly any time on the foreign dimension. And I think that's part of the reason for that maybe is because so much of what we want is just for the United States to stop doing all the horrible shit that it does right now, right? It's like a purely negative thing, it's like, don't do that, right? I mean, like, just think about any time there is, there's a war going on somewhere with U.S. boots on the ground, right? They demand of the anti-war left can be summed up in like 2 syllables, right? Like, out now. But then if you're actually serious about change in society, taking power, you also want to think about this further question, which is, okay, but we do want the United States to relate to the rest of the world somehow, right? And we can talk about some of those reasons, in terms of everything from issues like climate change victories that seem to require global responses, not just country by country a la carte responses, to how you would actually handle like genuine crises that do come up, that aren't just pretexts for imperialist meddling. So I want to, he is in a moving car right now.
I'm ready to go, baby. I'm ready
all
to
right,
go.
all right. Well, Daniel Bessner, you've spent more time thinking about this than anybody that I know. So start us off here.
So I'll just take the more macro level, and then everyone could sort of jump in or tell me where I'm wrong. So to me, there are a couple of major issues. So one is, let's say a left-wing candidate is elected, and there's moves on militarism. So there's the fundamental question of how do you actually go about getting rid of, the famous 750 bases? How do you actually go about getting rid of, say, the fact that the United States spends more than the next 10 countries combined on its military, currently has about 190,000 soldiers deployed abroad? So this is like the ultimate goal, right? There's a literal material instantiation of empire, and we want to get rid of it. So how do you do that? And I think right now, and it's fair to say, and please anyone disagree with me if you think I'm wrong, but it just doesn't seem like there's been much thought about that. So for example, when I was like one of, the people who were trying to think through what a Bernie foreign policy might be, one of the things that I kept on thinking about was we just fundamentally need like the task forces to study the issue, right? To find out where the weak points are, what bases could be closed tomorrow, what bases are connected to particular defense interests or particular Congress people. And I think that brings us to the next important obstacle that one would face, and that's the literal military industrial complex, which of course Eisenhower actually initially wanted to call the military industrial congressional complex, because I think we saw by the fact that last summer, for example, that Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, overwhelmingly voted against reducing the defense budget by what I consider to be a pretty modest, pretty light 10%. And one of the reasons that they did that is because of a lot of the Congress members have literal, defense plants in their districts, that to do something like that might put one of, jobs literally at risk. And this brings us to the final point, which I think is really important, and then I'll stop talking, but that there's the historical fact that in this country, in the United States, social democratic reforms, employment policies, et cetera, have always been linked to militarism. So Courtney back there, she studies this in her own work, right? The public housing that got going in LA was originally only got off the ground to house war workers. So there's a fundamental connection in this country, at least, between social democratic reform and American militarism, which is a very difficult thing to overcome. So to me, those are the large, like, hyper macro obstacles that we face. And now I'll stop chatting.
All right, Gene, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, well, I just want to add to that and to something you said, Ben, is, as the left, as people who are not liberal interventionists, but that have supported electoral politics, there has been a really, people have not wanted to engage with this question. If you're a revolutionary socialist and you want to withdraw everything and overthrow the system overnight, it's very easy to come up with a foreign policy, which is, like you say, out now. But we engage in left-wing social democratic electoral politics, which means we have to develop attitudes towards foreign policy, which are, of course, linked to the domestic policy, but it can't be disentangled from it. I mean, something that we've discussed, off camera is someone like Hitchens, who, after the end of the Cold War, is trying to find a kind of new principle on, how to intervene humanely. Now, we think he went wrong, obviously, with his support for liberal interventionism, but he was engaging with a question which was legitimate. During the Cold War, there were easy lines to follow. You could be against the American war in Vietnam. You could be critical of American foreign policy. But once the sort of international constellation of forces changes, I think a lot of the generation that grew up during the latter period of the Cold War either maintained the same line of, America out now, or ended up shifting towards kind of liberal interventionism. And I think it is incumbent on the social democratic left, especially as that social democratic left starts building congressional power, that we come up with some kind of policy that fills that gap between, international proletarian revolution and liberal interventionism. And that project has not been done, because I think people are allergic to thinking about deploying American power. And it's a complicated question. International relations is like a Jenga. You pull out one thing, what's going to be the cascade effect? One thing that the late Michael Brooks often talked about is like, we have to be kind of sensible with these kind of things. When we wrote about Syria and the U.S. withdrawal from Rojava, we were criticized about supporting imperialism. But, the argument was, well, what's happening there? U.S. is withdrawing forces, but Turkey, which is a part of the NATO alliance, is coming in and causing all kinds of havoc and trouble. So, how do we come across these very difficult questions, which end up with us having to perhaps make compromises? But how do we make those compromises without falling into liberal interventionism? And that's a really difficult thing that I don't have an answer to. But I hope these conversations can help us move towards some kind of notion of what a social democratic administration could do as a foreign policy. And then, as a corollary to that, is what do we do in terms of personnel? We discussed this with Daniel last week, foreign policy. Now, thinking about it, the idea of getting cadre for doing foreign policy is the easier of two questions. You could go around the country and find a bunch of lefty specialists on regional affairs to fill those spaces, and they would learn on the job. But then we get to the question of the military, because there is no alternative potential cadre that could replace those military officials and things like that. So I think there's this
which is true. Just to jump in, I mean, that's true. Even if you go through, even if you like really put on the reddest tinted glasses, you could and say, oh, our solution is like immediate international revolution. Well, the major historical example that the actual Russian Revolution. If you know anything about that history, they had to. Trotsky was only able to win the Russian Civil War with the help of a bunch of czarist generals, because it's not like who they managed to recruit to work for the revolution, because it's not like they had that alternative cadre of it's not like there were a bunch of ideologically committed communist generals waiting in the wings in October 1917.
And just very quickly, Ben, to add very quickly to that, I mean, it's beyond the Soviet Union. If you look at the German revolutions of 1918, 1919, which probably come the closest in sort of the quote-unquote North Atlantic Western context of what we might want to see, it was founded by a settlers' rebellion at Kiel, right? So these sorts of things almost never happen without some sort of military cadre supporting the revolution, which is something that I've been arguing for a while, that we need to really think about building consensus amongst military officers themselves, or creating a new generation in some meaningful way.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, Kuba, did you want to jump in?
I parse the problem a little differently. There's an international element, which is what kind of international system do we want to create to replace currently have, which is the de facto multipolarity. A friend of mine described it as war capitalism, that basically the militarization of every part of the global commons and a shredding of the rules and restraints that were created in the previous kind of liberal UN Cold War period. The second question, which is sort of the United States only, how do you downsize the military-industrial complex? How do you reform the practice of American foreign policy? How do you deal with all of the legacies of a century, 2 centuries of American imperialism? And those are related, but they're distinct. And I think that right now we're sort of jumping between the two. And I'd like to start with what a agenda would look like for the international community. And what we have now is the old liberal system based on UN agreements and sort of formal legalist multilateralism, while under the table you have a kicking contest between superpowers. And that kicking contest was the main show, but the institutions of the United Nations, multilateral agreements on things like the Postal Service, on the International Maritime Law, these things are real, and these things are not bad. They're actually stabilizing forces. Even if we go all the way back to the Treaty of Westphalia and the idea of sovereignty, national sovereignty and an international system, the fundamental problem of living in a world which has heterogeneous political units. Right now, there are Muslim divine right monarchs in not even just limited to the Gulf, but the Sultan of Brunei is an absolute monarch. You have different forms of totalitarianism. You have electoral systems, more or less neoliberal, and you have a few socialist governments out there. And they all have to coexist somehow in the international space. And there are some issues which require a global level of coordination between these different regime types that have very little in common, very little values or ideological basis for cooperation. So we need some kind of framework for that to happen. The old UN-style multilateralist framework was first torpedoed by American unilateralism following the end of the Cold War, shredded further by George W. Bush and the unilateral invasion of Iraq, and now Donald Trump is basically just going through every multilateral treaty and trying to cross it out. So there is a little bit of a vestige, a relic of that, which we could build on, but it's been replaced by this militarization of every part of the global commons. When you read the documents coming out of the Pentagon on a national security strategy, a national defense strategy, it's the constant drumbeat of blank is now a warfighting domain. The internet is now a warfighting domain. Cyberspace is now a warfighting domain. International law, international finance, space, the moon is a warfighting domain. Everything is being militarized, and every part of the global commons is getting a budget in the Pentagon for some kind of weaponization, whether it be Facebook, whether it be cyber warfare, whether it be space, drones, all types of things, weapons everywhere. And that's being met by America's rivals with an equal military buildup. And which, frankly, if you're Russia, if you're China, if you're North Korea, why wouldn't you do that? You have very real security anxieties about the weaponization of everything by the United States. You're on all of the lists. So we have a de facto arms race going on in all of these segments of the global commons, which used to be demilitarized, which were not prone to those kinds of arms races. And one of the very fundamental tenets of a new international order that I think democratic socialists should absolutely sponsor and support and lead is the demilitarization of these parts of the global commons.
Yeah.
That space is not a warfighting domain. The internet should not be a warfighting domain. And there are examples of things like maritime law, where you could have international agreements, international institutions, applying some kind of rule of law, some sort of framework of rules and investigations and enforcement to prevent the wholesale militarization of space or of the internet. And there's a very strong interest on all the in all the great powers for doing something like this, which is simply the risks of being the loser in a space arms race or in an internet arms race are existential. The costs of being a contender in that arms race are astronomical. There are, of course, there's a Russian military-industrial complex, a Chinese military-industrial complex, but especially in states that have less experience with the military driving all parts of public policy, those expenditures are painful, costly, and a little unnatural. So if you can reduce those costs by establishing a cyber Interpol, or and Russia has been pushing for the demilitarization of space ever since Sputnik, right? There are real interests on the part of external powers to see some pacifist framework established as long as the hegemon would abide by it.
Yeah.
And this American leadership, especially in a democratic socialist administration, could be absolutely decisive.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, right? So a lot of these kind of new frontiers of demilitarization, if we're imagining this scenario where the anti-war left is in control of the world's major superpower, it would be in a really good position to guide things in the other direction, because lesser powers would have this incentive to want to demilitarize those things. But I think that, kind of connecting to a couple threads of what Djene said and what Djene said, I think that if we think about taking a step beyond that and doing the sort of more straightforward kind of demilitarization, like, hey, we've got these however many however many like gazillion bases around the world, and we want and we'd rather that not be the case, right? We don't want the United States to have this vast network of military bases everywhere. That is something that is natural that you want to need if you want to have an empire and you want to be able to strike all over the place, really, really quickly. But if that's not the role that you want to have in the world, that you don't want that. But there are a couple of different obstacles to even that part, right? Which is, like, in some ways the most straightforward part of what we want this democratic socialist foreign policy to be, because it's maybe not out now, but out part, right? It's the sort of, in a sense, the easy negative part, right? We want to not have that. But even getting from having that to not having that, there are a couple of problems that Djene was bringing up and that Djene was bringing up, right? So the domestic problem that Djene was bringing up is that traditionally in America, what bits and pieces of social democracy that we have are really bound up with the warfare state. From the public housing example to the GI Bill to the things stopping congressmen from wanting to take down bases that exist even domestically, and in some ways, I mean, obviously, all of this is much easier said than done, right? But in some ways, that's maybe the obstacle that's the easiest to do something about, or at least it's the easiest, maybe not to actually do it, but it's the easiest to see what doing something about it would look like. Because the solution to all of these incentives to keep, the entanglement between, we have all these incentives to keep this level of military spending because it fulfills these kinds of social democratic functions, is to have social democracy that's not linked to that, right? Say, look, you don't need the public housing, that's linked to military spending. We can just have, we can have massive public investment in public housing for everybody. We don't need to have the military bases in your district. We don't need to have the military base in your district because we're going to have a federal jobs guarantee. So, so people in your district can be employed without that. But then I think that the issue that Djene is pointing to with his example about Rojava is a little bit trickier, right? Because then you think, okay, well, what about all the foreign military bases? Look, I lived in South Korea for 3 years. That's a place that has a bunch of them, and if you got rid of all of those tomorrow, then we could argue, and people who are specialists can argue about how bad that would be, whether at this point South Korea really can kind of fend for itself, right? And it would be fine, or maybe not, right? But the obvious concern is that from the perspective of an anti-war left, right, the last thing we would want, the thing that would be kind of the opposite of our overall goal in all of this, would be restarting the Korean War. Well,
there's a practical solution to that, which is not necessarily ideologically loaded, and is less challenging than you might think. And that requires a rethinking of a fundamental doctrine of American military power, which is the moving away from the idea of projecting force. Right now, whether it's cruise missiles, whether it's bombers, whether it's drones, the United States penetrates other countries' airspace, territory, and strikes at their command and control centers, strikes their strategic infrastructure, and destroys things in a forward fashion. Given right now, actually, just because of changes in military technology and the dispersal of certain types of IT and certain types of weapons internationally, that doctrine is already under threat. And specifically, I'm talking about anti-access area denial weapon systems, which is a combination of electronic warfare, sensors, short-range interdiction missiles to take down aircraft, drones, ships entering sensitive waters or sensitive areas. Shifting the military forces that exist right now, American forces in Korea, which are bombers, which are their forward strike weapons. They're inherently hostile to North Korea. They're inherently hostile to China because they are used to blow up Beijing. They're used
an offshore balancing type issue, that type of approach.
The idea is to shift away from an offensive striking capacity to an anti-access area defense capacity that prevents hostile weapons, whether Chinese, North Korean, from entering areas which make South Korea or Japan vulnerable.
My issue with that approach is basically we're talking a bit about the offense-defense balance, right? Like this is for non-specialists, basically what Kuba's arguing is that like right now the defense is theoretically, able to take advantage of the offense. But the problem with that, and I'm curious what you'd say, is that in my view, that's still the American empire being the American empire, right? It's still kind of dominating East Asia. It's still like picking winners isn't the right phrase, but it's still like the way that I would view it. And this might be like my original training in 19th century German philosophy. It's like still distorting quote unquote organic developments by not allowing people in the region to reach a concordat with each other, right? And to me, like that is the ultimate only way we're going to get the type of international institutions that you rightly emphasize, because I think the major problem with organizations like the UN, the IMF, the GATT, WTO, whatever it may be, is that these are and I think in their origins, if you look at Stephen Wertheim's new book, very much tools of American armed primacy. So there's a fundamental lack of legitimacy to all of these institutions. So to me, the ultimate like left goal is a globalist world, right? So how do you get there? I think step one has to be the dismantling of the empire, and then step two is to try to come to some sort of meaningful, at least globally coherent, legitimate consensus about how to deal with transnational problems. And I don't think that could be done if, because right now the defense might take account, but, in 20 years, the offense is going to, come back again because that's what always happens, right? People are arguing that the machine gun would be impenetrable, now you get the tank. So I think that these things go back and forth, and we have to focus more on that sort of structural imperial issue to get the world that we want to see, if that makes sense.
So Danny, what, like, I think the part 90s kids will get this. You yada yada the most important part, right? There's something that kind of went by real quick there. Was okay. What we want to be doing instead is having globally acceptable ways of dealing, with. So it's like, okay, I want to know more about that, right? Like what would that be?
I think it starts with great power cooperation, right? I mean, it's just the fact, just like Harvard sets the tone of American colleges, the United States and the PRC set the tone of the world. And I think that's just the reality of the situation. It might not be what we want, but that's what we've got. So I think the first thing to do is like not have a new Cold War with China, not try to change Chinese domestic politics, which is problematic given things like the Uyghurs, right? That's horrible. It's problematic given things like mass incarceration in the United States, for that matter. But I think like this is where I'm a bit more of a realist than other people on the left, and that I do think that a lot of the tone of global politics is legitimately set by great powers with regional spheres of influence. Now, I know there's been some thinking on the left that's like anti-sphere of influence, but to me, it's always relied on sort of like fantasy transnational organization and transnational solidarity that doesn't actually exist. So I would say step one is great power competition, and then step two is making sort of regional alliances. And actually, Ben, Michael and I talked a lot about this. I think one of the things that the left could do is try to get create a real democratic polity that encompasses Canada, America, and Mexico, right? Like try to build up these larger regional polities, these regional blocks. We could start thinking in more global terms. So I mean, those two projects will last 5 lifetimes, but I think like this is like the way that we need to be thinking, at least eyes on the prize, because I think regions following Wallerstein are significant blocks. They really do work together in a meaningful way, and on the left needs to think a bit more regionally. Stop thinking about like fantasies of like global worker organization. There really could be organization between workers in Canada, America, and Mexico in a real way. They're so linked. And to take the Marxist perspective, like maybe NAFTA was what we had to go through, the orthodox Marxist perspective, just to be a little bit like dramatic about it, because that created a truly integrated economy. That might be the foundation of a social democracy. Just to end on a bit of a controversial point.
Cuba, you want to?
Yeah, and I want to, at the risk of dragging it back to 10 minutes ago, I think that it's the point that shifting to a defensive deployment of weapons across Southeast and Northeast Asia would keep the United States in this forward military posture. However, we have to take some baby steps. We're not going to go all the way to a concordant. Right now, a concordant between South Korea and Japan actually is just unthinkable. They hate each other. There's some very strong that's been built up in the last generation, especially between both countries, and without an American security blanket over both of them, then quite likely we'd be looking at a Korean-Japanese arms race. There's
you think in the face of China?
Yes, absolutely. I think that one or the other would Korea would bandwagon with China against Japan.
So I mean, in a sense, so be it then. I mean, like, isn't that for the people of the region to determine? I mean, this is where I come down on that.
It's all well and good until Osaka is in cinders, right? Like there's the way to reach.
What is the American national interest in Osaka, though? I mean, this is like a post-1945 way of viewing things. You know, like ideally there'd be no war ever, but at some point
there's an American national interest in, as you point out, and this is once again Wallerstein, right? It's not just regions. There's also international supply chains. Think about the supply of semiconductors for American high-tech industry comes from East Asia. There's all kinds of precursor chemicals, chips, and electronic hardware that is only sourced out of a handful of these high-tech East Asian countries. And even if the United States, through a sort of hands-off approach, maintains open market access with China and Japan, if both countries are on fire because the shooting started, well, there's no semiconductors. And that's a major consideration.
But that's the argument that the imperialists made to justify American empire. Like, this is always the argument, right? Because, like, if the argument is that the U.S. isn't there, then there'll be wars. And I'll say that's for the people of the region to decide. You know, like, it's not... Is my point...
I see your point. However, there's also an argument to be made for global security considerations that prevent a war that kills 50 million Japanese and Koreans. I think that there's a pretty strong humanitarian case for that. And we just have to accept, too, that we live with a legacy that comes from America's role up until this point in the world. And we can draw it down and we can change it, but it's not going to change instantly. There's consequences for moving too quickly. And what we want to do is we want to incubate that concordant, get China involved in the in a U.S., Japanese, Korean security dialogue about Northeast Asia, about North Korea. Involve all of the regional powers and create a regionalization out of, like, as you're exiting, rather than leaving and letting the chips fall where they may.
So I guess we probably want to. I know Jane wants to get in, but I want to separate out a little bit two different questions that I think we might be mashing together. Right, one is the baby step question. Right, like you said, I don't think anybody here thinks that that the way to draw down U.S. empire is to have, you know, President AOC or whoever, you know, say on you know, like some January 23rd or something, okay, we're done, right? You know, like everybody come home now, you know, like the you know, the empire is over. You know, I think that obviously you want to do these things in ways that don't you know, that don't start a bunch of fires that, you know, that could cause mass death, right? You know, like I'd be surprised if that were a point of contention here. But then I think the question is, okay, baby steps towards what, right? Like after you know, all right, you have to do these things gradually. There might be lots of intermediary steps. There might be lots of, you know, multilateral agreements that are part of it. But eventually, right, what you want is, and so what I think I'm kind of hearing from Djene is what you want eventually are, maybe you're not going to have super strong versions at any point ever, right, of international institutions that are just totally global and can globally stop like any wars from happening anywhere. Maybe that's just not how it works, but we could at least have like really strong regional institutions, and that's kind of the answer. And that in that scenario, right, after you've done all the baby steps, right, you know, after you're done, then it really would be the case that if there was, you know, it looked like, you know, Korea and Japan were on the brink of war, then you know, maybe the civil society part of like the ruling American Socialist Party would, like, you know, send some delegates to, you know, be in solidarity with peace demonstrations in Korea or whatever, but that would be kind of the end of it, right? That would be it, right? So, and I guess I'm curious, and like I said, I know, Gene, you want to jump in, and that's fine, right? But like but I am curious if there's like an alternate vision on the table, right? If like, all right, that's kind of what I'm getting from Djene. Then like, what's behind door number 2?
I mean, in terms of my thoughts, it depends what the objective of moving from an offensive posture to a defensive posture is. If that is a way to retrench and maintain a permanent presence, obviously the difference is one of emphasis rather than a qualitative difference. However, if that shift towards a more defensive posture in East Asia, for example, is a prelude to withdrawing, and as part of a step, like Kuba said, to incubate some kind of like alternative arrangement, I think it's useful. The risk, of course, is that, you know, you go to this defensive posture, but then, of course, there's no long-term plan to withdraw. And we see around the world, you know, when that's the biggest problem, is that you end up with a situation like Afghanistan where, you know, at the end of the day, you know, defensive, offensive posture, whatever, it's like completely pointless. So, of course, like, I think these technical fixes like moving the offensive doctrine are important, but I think they have to be understood within a broader context of a withdrawal, an eventual withdrawal of America from the region. And then, you know, we do have precedents for sort of, you know, not directly linked to government peacemaking organizations. Both the Republican and the Democratic Party have their kind of like international peacemaking groups. I forget the names, but when I was in Iraq in 2004, there was one of the groups which was connected with the Democratic Party. They brought two Serbian people over to talk about inter-ethnic peace in Kirkuk, which I thought was kind of interesting. But you would hope that like a social democratic movement would be a movement, and obviously would be able to build those kind of relations on a non-governmental level. But I do think we have to like think seriously about how do we take step by step from withdrawing from these regions and then moving to this new order. Because of course, by moving, if moving to a defensive posture it's made clear that this is part of a longer term plan of withdrawal, then that creates perhaps creates a space in which an alternative arrangement in which the regional powers are involved. Of course, there's a risk that that won't happen, but I think that it's an important situation to consider about the technicalities of extricating the United States from the region on a technical level. Like, how do we do it? Like, we don't want to shut everything off on January the 1st, 2028 or something, right? But we want to be well on the way to withdrawing by 2032 or something like that. We need a concrete plan to withdraw, and it's always a risky. Withdrawing from a situation is always a risky because once once people realize you're going, then all kinds of things can be tension.
Yeah, I mean, look, you don't want this to. I mean, you think back to like the mid to late 2000s when there were still some people. John McCain famously said while he was running for president that it was totally cool if we stayed in Iraq for the next 100 years. But
Max Boot said that recently.
Oh yeah,
Max Boot called it a 300-year war. I mean, these are like real arguments that people make. Sorry to interrupt that, but it's a common thing you hear in the foreign policy establishment.
Yeah, right. And of course that position, as horrifying as it is, right? I mean, at least gets some kind of points for internal consistency, coherence, right? It's like at least it's clear what they want. Whereas in a lot of mainstream discourse by then, right, people who were acknowledging you couldn't do that, right, that you shouldn't do that the U.S. should never have been in Iraq in the first place, and that we did not, in fact, want to have bases in Baghdad in the 22nd century. But there's also this thing where there was a lot of ways that that liberals certainly gave Obama, but even before Obama, even Bush, like way too much leeway, because they would say some things that kind of sound like some of the things that we've been saying, like, oh well, you can't do these things overnight, it's very complicated, you don't want things to get worse, when you leave. But then I think this gets to Jane's point, which is that okay, but if that can't always be a conversation ender, right? Because if you say, all right, well, we're going to draw down the empire just as soon as that doesn't lead to any bad consequences, then the world is messy. You're always going to get something bad that might be about to happen. So you do have to, if it's really important to you to draw down the empire, like at some point you do have to accept some bad consequences.
What I think is going to happen, and Kuba, I'll let you go just very quickly. My prediction is that something like the U.S. doesn't foster the security transition that I think is critical. I totally agree. And China does something like, okay, we're going to fucking invade Taiwan. The U.S. is like, we're not going to fight World War III, and they're out of there. That's what I think the path we're currently on, if nothing changes. Something like that is going to happen. Would be my prediction.
I think that that's entirely possible. I also think it's possible that someone like Max Boot says we just have to bark and fire a few Hellfire missiles at the PLA boats in the Taiwan Strait, and then you end up in World War III. But I wanted to pick up on a couple of things. One is I feel like I've become the goalpost of maintaining the status quo. Because in Asia, I've been emphasizing the need to be very careful and not precipitous in removing American security forces. I think that you could probably do it if not quite overnight, in a very short amount of time, is Europe. The NATO is a robust institution which does not need, it can operate without American supervision. Not only that, but the European Union is already a robust regional alliance and network. The states in Western Europe have a capacity to defend themselves. They have responsible and capable governments. There's no reason for them not to take responsibility for the security of the continent. And there's also not that many barriers to them reaching a deal with Russia on the most sensitive issues. In fact, I think the American presence there right now is a spoiler. I'm not saying that the United States needs to be everywhere. I'm saying that you have to look at the specifics of each situation to see what the most prudent move forward would be. In 2005, 2006, when things were going bad in Iraq, I always thought Iraq was a terrible idea. And a lot of my friends who agreed with me, this is Berkeley, they were all saying, well, but now we broke it, we bought it, right? We need to stay there, we need to fix it. It's a very standard kind of prudential argument. I said, if you were going to rebuild it, if America could be expected to put Iraq back together again, then fine, do it, do that. But you're not going to do that. You're not going to invest the money. You're not going to invest the time. There's just no way that George W. Bush's America is going to Marshall Plan Iraq back together. So what you need to do is figure out how to lose in the least destructive way possible. And my proposal was make Muqtada al-Sadr enemy number one, say that you really want to kill him, that he's the worst, that you really hate him, all of America despises him, paint a giant target on his back, and then be like, I guess he beat us, and leave. And now you've handed over the Iraqi political situation to a domestic agent with some legitimacy that you've given him by raising him as a threat, as an enemy. He can claim the legitimacy of victory in an anti-imperialist struggle. And it's kind of incumbent on Iraqi forces to come up with their own situation, which they can't do a worse job than the United States did since 2006.
Yeah, so I know Daddy wants to get in on this. I just want to say I do want to open this up to some questions for the chat, since we do still live under capitalism. Super chats go to the front of the line, but I mean, I think to kind of like refocus, it a little, right? Like, so, part of why that kind of response, right, when people were arguing about withdrawing from Iraq, and you get this, we broke it, you bought it thing, right? So there are like at least two different reasons to have a problem with that, right? One is just pragmatically, like you're saying, it's just not going to work out that way. The second, though, is that I mean, the framing itself is pretty damn suggestive of like exactly the worst kind of imperial mindset, right? Like if you had been broken, how would you feel about thinking that the people who broke you now owned you, right? So I think they're both principled and pragmatic reasons to have a problem with that, which the only reason to kind of take a step back to highlight that is that both of those are relevant to the conversation, because as I think was kind of suggested earlier, both of those reasons to want to wind down American empire might in some situations come into conflict with each other, because we pragmatically want to avoid bad things happening. And we also want to, let other people, arrange their lives, their societies, without hegemonic domination, by the United States. And if you're arguing about whether to invade Iraq, great, both of those are pointed in the same direction. Don't do it. But if you're talking about, okay, how quickly do you dismantle the empire in the face of the fires that might get caused by doing that too quickly, those two things do maybe come into conflict a little bit. But Danny, I know you wanted to jump in.
Just very quickly, I think the reason that I'm a bit skeptical of the argument Kuba made is because of Vietnam, right? Like this was Kissinger argument to stay in Vietnam, the decent interval. By 68, everyone in the United States says we've lost this fucking war. But then the strategy is how do you leave? And it was Kissinger and Nixon who said we need a decent interval. We need them to last just a little bit before we leave. And that led the war to go on for another 5 years.
Oh,
So
no,
I think
I'm on your side here.
no, I totally, and I think this is the problem because there's always going to be a shitty situation when this empire dismantles itself. It is going to be terrible. There's just no way around it. There's going to be population movements. There's going to be new hegemons. There's going to be all of these different things. So then the question is, how do you do it in the least damaging way? Which I think is an important. Which I think is ultimately what you're doing. But in the same time, in the historical reality of the situation, that argument almost feeds in to the imperialists in a sense, right? Like, because they're always going to want to push it off. You know, they're always going to want to say, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe there's just no way around that, but that's why I'm a bit skeptical.
Well, this is one reason why I think you do Europe first and you do Europe as quickly as possible. Because nothing succeeds like success. If you have a demonstration effect of having an effective drawdown with a smooth handover to regional bodies, regional security apparatus, the countries reaching a concordant of their own, and the EU is 90% of the way there. It's the easy case. You do that first. You do that first to establish a precedent, to show that it can be done, and to create momentum and expectation in other places that you're going to reproduce that. You don't start with the hard cases because nothing succeeds like success, but nothing fails like failure. If you draw down expeditiously in a place that really matters, like East Asia, and it leads to a awful conflagration or the conquest of Taiwan, then good luck getting rid of empire anywhere else.
And I would just add to that, you know, another place where you can withdraw pretty quickly is also the Middle East, because America has a very deleterious effect on the Middle East. Iran, there is no reason why the United States should be favoring Saudi Arabia over Iran. Both are undemocratic regimes, both are appalling on human rights. So there's no reason, there's no like useful reason for the United States to be playing that role and helping to stoke conflict between Iran and making Iran more paranoid. There's no reason why the United States needs bases in Turkey either. They can withdraw from that reason. So I think there are places, I think I would agree with Kuba. There are places that you need to get out of quick, like Afghanistan. You're going to have to get out quick. It's like done. It's finished. And, you know, one of the problems is, you know, American psychology. Americans think they can fix everything everywhere. So they have a hard time dealing with the fact that they couldn't do anything in Afghanistan. But that has to be accepted as a defeat. Rest of the Middle East, withdraw relatively quickly, and encourage those. In Syria, one of the big obstacles has been that the United States has stopped the Rojava making an agreement with the Assad regime. The Assad regime is not great, but the United States should be pulling out of there and, you know, preparing for some kind of alternative arrangement with the Assad regime, not trying to, literally as Trump is doing, sticking around to nakedly take the oil, right? So, you know, I think Middle East, Europe, and Africa are places where the United States needs to just get out of within like 2 years of within a year, 2 years of an administration coming to power. East Asia, I'm not so familiar with, but, you know, it seems that there's a lot more riding on what happens in East Asia. Middle East and Europe is completely, you know, I think having successes there builds that political capital to further dismantle the empire. Because again, you know, America has elections, and if we're conceiving that we have a kind of social democratic administration, we don't want it to be overrun by international war immediately. I mean, I wonder what Danny thinks about that.
I think that's right. I mean, I think the big issue in the sort of anti-militarist community is always over East Asia. Like I was at a luncheon with John Mersheimer, the famous realist, who basically agrees get out of Europe, get out of Middle East, and we had like an hour and a half conversation about East Asia. And this is the big issue. My only worry is knowing what I know about American history. Everything is going to go towards staying within this. I mean, it provides the military industrial complex, the military intellectual complex. You have a seemingly potentially existential enemy in China who perfectly for this country who's not like white, right? Who's of a quote unquote different race. So just everything is just pointing toward that just being there forever. And I'm particularly worried about World War III because I mean just the sheer I mean I appreciate Kuba's point about everything that like the international trade linkages, but the fact of the matter is it's just a region more important to China. Flat out. You know, so I'm just worried about us being there is damaging. Yeah.
So James Holland, thank you so much for the super sticker. There are a couple of questions in the chat I want to get to, but first I wanted to just follow up on what Danny just said, because I think you know, if you want to draw down American empire, you are willing to be a little bit of a pragmatist about it. You don't want to burn everything down in the course of doing so, and East Asia is the sticking point. Then I think like a fairly look. I mean, I think in like kind of brutal realpolitik terms, like one obvious way of squaring the circle here is to say, all right, well maybe there are some of these hot button issues here that make it very hard to just you don't want things to blow up in the absence of the current reigning hegemon, but hey, who could be an alternative reigning hegemon there is China, right? They're willing and eager and able, right? And obviously that's not great in many ways. I would. But I think that at least I think a transition from the United States as the sort of final guarantor of the security issues there to China doing it. I mean, like many people with many interests there would have all sorts of complaints about that. But is that like the least bad option, all things considered?
Oh no, it's just a matter of how you do it. You need to buy time for and space for China to chill out. Right now, one problem is, and the reason that China can't already play that role is because as much as Asian countries complain about the United States in the region, China is terrifying. China, the People's Republic of China, is extraordinarily frightening and threatening to the Philippines, to Taiwan, especially to Japan. The level of animus, social animus between these societies is extraordinarily high. And without some transition period for China to be able to build some confidence with its neighbors and with other countries in the region, without some lowering of the Chinese threat assessment about what the United States, what Japan, what the American alliance system, what the new Quad, right? The India, Japan, the United States, Australia, what that security alliance is trying to do to the PRC. China is legitimately threatened by all of these developments. You need some time to lower the temperature and to foster the space for living arrangement. If you don't do that, if you do it too precipitously, then there's so many risks of miscalculation, of accident, of just the social animus leading to a World War I type situation where everybody decides that they really want to fight because they hate each other. And the American presence and the switch to a defensive posture is there to buy the time to make that happen. And you move quickly in other regions in order to show that transition is possible, to create momentum behind it, and to show that this is really the future, right? That America is serious about drawing down, and there is a template to do it successfully.
Oh, so I did want to transition to a couple things that people are asking about in chat, which are very different subjects, but in kind of our last few minutes here, I would like to cover both of them, at least briefly. So one of them was about the election. And so the first part, which I think, person asking is a leftist, so I assume they're not being totally serious about this, is Biden going to be great on foreign policy? And I think the answer is obviously no, right? Move on. But they have, but obviously, Biden, beyond like the greatest hits, like voting for the Iraq War, was also a very strong proponent of expanding the drone program under Obama and lots of other terrible things. But then the second half of their question, I think this was Richard Sager in the chat, was about the contrast with Trump, and I think that's interesting. I think that's like maybe a little bit more speculative, obviously, but just really quickly, right? To the extent that this is part of what's at stake in the election, right? Like, what is the kind of Plan Colombia, et cetera, right? We don't need to like sit here and do, half an hour, even if we were going to continue for half an hour on how bad Biden is. But what is actually the kind of cash value of the Biden-Trump distinction probably actually going to be in foreign policy? You have any thoughts, Gene?
I mean, it's more about the negativity of the Trump approach rather than anything positive about Biden. Trump's foreign policy is nakedly transactional, and that's a destabilizing thing in itself. We see, Trump views international relations very much as he views, business transactions, and quite openly wants to turn the United States into kind of mercenary force, which he gets paid for. We've seen that in Saudi Arabia. And I think that is probably not a very healthy thing to do. I think also perhaps, it's a mask down moment, so it's beneficial in some sense that Trump is just nakedly wanting to seize other countries' natural resources, whereas someone like Biden might cloak that in a veneer of human rights and things like that. But I think ultimately the problem is Trump is not going to wind down an American empire, and he's going to act erratically and extremely transactionally, and is going to be more destabilizing than Biden would be. But that's not really a strong argument in favor of Biden. It's more of a concern that the erratic nature and the type of people who end up signing up on to Trump, despite all the shenanigans, are really hardcore interventionists. Like Pompeo is not some kind of dove who's like eager to put an end to American overseas adventures. So Trump, the cadre of Trump, of people that Trump's bring in, are the B-list, incompetent, even more incompetent neocons. So Trump. I think a lot of people were figuring that Trump has this kind of anti-war sort of instinct, but it's kind of irrelevant when we see what the United States has done under Trump. And so Biden, at worst, it's a sidestep.
Yeah. So right. So I think that's important to emphasize because there's I think a mythology that even some people on the left buy into. Which is that Trump is like maybe like some sort of right-wing isolationist who's whatever, we don't like the motivations, but we might like the result. That I hear a lot of people saying, Trump hasn't started any new wars, which Forrest, who's the video editor for the show, had a good line about this on Twitter. He was like, yeah, so like this is really what you're taking a bow for, that like none of the U.S. proxy wars, that despite the best efforts of people like Pompeo, have actually spilled over into entirely new hot wars. Like let's do a slow clap about that, right? If anything, in fact, Trump has a lot of the restrictions, like for example on the drone program that Obama put in towards the end, where you have to have some. I mean, this is all obviously grotesquely insufficient. Like at bottom line, we're still sending flying killer robots around the world to kill people without trial in countries we're not at war with. But Obama did put in some restrictions about the process that you have to go through before you assassinate somebody and who has to sign off on it and so on. And Trump got rid of all that, very, very early, right? That they have like, so commanders on the ground can do a lot of those things directly, right? So I think but then I think the further question is, once you dispense with that myth of Trump the right-wing isolationist, then is it just going to be a step sideways to Biden, or is there some sort of at least harm reduction argument you can make on foreign policy, even understanding that Biden is extremely interventionist and very, very bad on this stuff? Danny?
Just very quickly, I want to explain to people, my dog ingested something poisonous, so I had to go drive her an hour to get like her stomach basically pumped. So apologies, that's why I'm on the road, and my phone is actually about to die. So I just wanted to answer this question and apologize to everyone. Did not intend for her to eat roach food. So apologies for that. But I just want to say the way that I've been framing it is that I don't think it's easy, because I do think that Biden is going to appoint people who are going to be very competent, like Michelle Flourney, who know the DOD bureaucracy, like Susan Rice, who's been on the NSC a bunch, like Samantha Power. So in some sense, they actually have the opportunity to do a lot of damage to the world if this liberal interventionist foreign policy goes through. So the big question to me is going to be more like Obama's first term, which was more interventionist, or is it going to be more like Obama's second term, which was a bit more skeptical about the use of military power? And given who Biden has floated, it does seem like it's going to be more like the first term. So that is the real thing that I'm worried about. But guys, my phone's about to die.
Okay, last question before you go, Danny.
Okay, quickly.
What's your dog's name?
Vera, named after Vera the Suzdalich, who spoke up to about the revolution happening in Russia, or in Tsarist Russia. So I just guys, I'm so sorry about this. It was not planned.
All right,
but I hope you forgive me.
All right,
thanks guys.
Danny. All right, so do want to wrap up in the next couple of minutes, but I did want to address one last thing from the chat, which is that I think there were a few versions of the same basic question that maybe we can like just merge into one, or comment in some cases, right? Which is that there's a kind of sentiment, people expressing in the chat that's like, hey, here's the, here's the democratic socialist foreign policy that we want. Yankee, go home. Don't start any new wars, right? Like, what do you want, right? And so I think one way of making the case that, although obviously we all agree with the basic sentiment, one way of making the case that's more complicated is the one that I think has already been made over the course of the stream, about how you want to do these things, what unintended consequences you want to avoid while you're drawing down American empire abroad. But the other way of addressing it, right, is something that we actually haven't talked about at all. And so I think maybe in the last couple minutes of the stream, it'd be good if we talk about just a little bit, because I think it's such an important part of the issue is, well, one reason why the question of how a democratic socialist government in the U.S. would relate to the rest of the world is important. That has nothing to do with anything we've talked about, except in the sense of what Djene was talking about the U.S. so much of U.S. policy in the Middle East being about propping up Saudi Arabia. Is global climate change, right? I mean, like that's just a really, really clear-cut case of a way that we that just sort of purely negative anti-imperialism isn't good enough, right? Because we do want, like you can Green New Deal the hell out of the U.S. on its own. And that would be great, right? That would cut out a big part of the problem, but nothing like all or even most of the problem, right? You do need some sort of international cooperation. and that seems like something that we do want to talk about at least kind of maybe for a minute before we get off. Gene, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think this ties into the ways that foreign policy links with domestic policy. Oil is an internationally traded commodity, and the United States' military presence around the world, just by protecting shipping lanes, maintain the oil at a certain price. So transitioning away from an oil-based economy is fundamental to this, a fundamental part of this withdrawal. Reindustrializing the United States and perhaps thinking in a Mexico-Canada way of creating a kind of regional, let's not say self-sufficient or autarkic, but largely self-sufficient region with its own industrial base. And obviously, that's another way that we unentangle the United States from the world. So I think, and you raised it at the beginning, in the past, American social democracy has been tied to war. A lot of the general programs were linked to militaries, like you mentioned, the GI Bill. Even today, if you want free college, you have to go fight for your country. So we have to both create like a social democracy that is not dependent on the military, and reorder our economy, reindustrialize, and Green New Deal things, so that the United States is in a much better position to extricate it from itself, from the world, and then work internationally to try and deal with these big issues that we have to deal with, like climate change.
So, I think that when it comes to climate change, you're absolutely correct that there needs to be a fundamental economic adjustment within the United States. Reindustrialization is part of it. And I think that regionalization is advantageous, but there needs to be some global coordination as well. There's a risk of regional economic integration leading to a kind of interwar situation where you have a British Empire, a French Empire, a sort of Soviet bloc, a Japanese empire, where they're in theory or aspirationally autarkic and sufficient, but the conflict between them, the lack of coordination mechanisms between them, leads to spiraling security problems and also a failure to align on an ideological line, right? One advantage of this post-Cold War moment that we're in is you have plenty of crypto-fascists, but there aren't that many fascists out there. And the human rights has been horribly tarnished by decades of rhetorical abuse by the United States, most especially, but other Western countries as well. However, even when it's purely observed in the breach, the fact that that's a marker, that's a departure point for discussion, as opposed to let's just brutalize the hell out of inferior races, is something that's worth holding on to. And I think that we also need to recognize that there is a developmental distinction between certain economies and other ones. You have high tech, you have innovation, and you have research breakthroughs occurring in some countries and not in others. You also have China, but some other Asian countries as well, being the major industrial producers. If you're going to develop, say, Africa, then sub-Saharan Africa, a large country like Angola, it's going to require technological inputs from advanced countries, and it's going to require industrial inputs from centers like China. And there should be at least a template for how to do that in a way which is the least ecologically disruptive, which addresses human needs rather than profit-motivated extraction, which and involves countries at every relevant level of development. Angola isn't going to be able to do it by itself. And just the nature of production chains means you're going to have some level of multilateral coordination. I think that one thing that advanced Western countries especially, but also places like Japan, Singapore, South Korea need to work on is changing modes of consumption. There's a real consumption problem in the type of carbon-heavy lifestyles that people live in these countries because they can afford to, the type of waste that they produce, the way that that waste is handled and processed. Some countries do it better than others, but just by shifting to less intensive forms of consumption, that's an adjustment that will need to be coordinated across the advanced industrial economies, and also a shift away from, like vaporware and fast fashion towards the things that actually bring value, which are innovation and research. And I think that some level of international global coordination needs to take place. If every region is doing this separately, then there's a risk of spiraling competition and paranoia kicking in, as well as inefficiencies. But, we're not economists, so we care less about that.
Fair enough. All right. Thank you guys both so much. Gene,
Thank you.
It's a pleasure as always. Kuba, it's really great to meet you. Definitely want you back on. So I want to, and also I think it would be very complete. It's obviously alluded to in the thumbnail for this, but given the topic, should say that actually just now, since the last time we did one of these streams, something good actually happened for once, which is the restoration of democracy in Bolivia, which through the victory of the Evo Morales' movement for socialism. Once they finally had the election, that was they ran out of excuses not to have it, and I think it's a really useful reminder that since we obviously spent all of this time in the stream talking about the complications with what we want, the ways that that drawing down the U.S. empire in the wrong ways can lead to bad things, and how you avoid that at the same time as doing it in the right way. But it's also worth it's a really such a vivid reminder that for longer than that, right? But especially in the last century, the United States, our imperial domination of Latin America, especially, has been a massive obstacle to peace and democracy, in those countries. And so I think that the drawing down of that, even having a case where, kind of going to what Kuba was talking about a minute ago, where at least the ideological pretext, has to be a little bit more finessed. You can't just sort of say, you can't just sort of be like the British Empire and just say, sorry, they're inferior. We're gonna, we're gonna dominate them, and we don't need a more excuse than that, right? You have to have these pretexts. Does create openings to have these victories, like what just happened in Bolivia. So that's worth celebrating. But we're definitely going to have to go back and do this again. I think maybe have like a stream in the near future that's just focused on the China East Asia thing, because that came up so much today. But meanwhile, I am going to end it there. So thank you guys both so much.
Thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you. Pleasure was mine.